Okay, now we're going to turn and look at some of the key themes. But first, let's step back for just a second and look at the key themes of this whole study that we've been doing of humanities. And so what were some of the key themes that we said we were going to look at in this course? We were going to look at the rise of individualism, and we will see how Dewey contributes to that. In fact, that's a major theme in his whole philosophy. Also, we said we were going to look at the emerging and the maturing of democratic forms of governance. And so he definitely is going to contribute to that because he thinks that democracy is the best way to govern people, and also it is, for him, it's the most rational way to govern people. We also looked at the doctrine of religious influence. In other words, how religious influence has started to decline in Western civilization during the period of modernity. You can also see that in Dewey as well. Then we will look at the steady increase of modernism, all the basic concepts that modernism entails, with its emphasis on science and technology as a way to true progress and as a way to true knowledge about pretty much anything, okay? That's the modern way. So pragmatism itself is an early 20th century movement. In other words, it comes to its full fruition in early 20th century, and it will propel all of these trends forward to new heights. And we will see, that those trends continue pretty much up to the present in the 21st century. So in Dewey and in pragmatism in general, these developments mature and intensify, perhaps even to extremes. So first, let's look at Dewey's worldview in brief. He is a naturalist. He is a modernist in every sense of the word. And he embraces the modern and secular dream very tightly. He believes that this entails a complete shunning of what we saw earlier in the very beginning of the course, the pre-modernist view of the world. He's in a sense a secular humanist, okay? I think, not that he would explicitly embrace that title, but I think he fits within that whole panoply of ideas. In other words, eschewing classical humanism, those guys that we saw at the beginning of the semester during the Renaissance who wanted to embrace the past and hold on to it, okay? So Dewey is more of the secular humanist or an exclusive humanist, looking forward to the future, to progress, and so forth and so on through science and technology and empirical methodology, okay? So he is going to turn away from the whole idea of there being some kind of an essence. Now Dewey, he was an extremely educated individual. He fully understood the old Greek ideas, the idea of there being essence and so forth, and that this essence, whatever something is, it has an essence, and that view persists all the way up, into the 19th century. Not that it was starting to wane, but he did start off believing that himself as an idealist, but he's going to reject that and become this full-blown naturalist, okay? He's going to become a radical empiricist, and we will see what that means here just in a minute. And he's going to thoroughly embrace an egalitarian, if not a radical egalitarian society based upon the social contract theory of rule by consent, or otherwise known as democracy. Now Dewey considered himself a naturalist, and eventually he's going to buy fully into the Darwinist view of the world. And he understands human nature as evolving from the lower species. We've had the whole lecture on Darwin. And in some ways he has similarities to Marx, though. And there were times when he was accused of being a communist, but that was more because of different stands that he took on some hot button issues here and there, and people just kind of labeled him as a communist. But he doesn't really draw upon Marx's ideas, and he doesn't really espouse outright communist ideas. But he has some similarities to Marx in this sense, both he and Marx started off as Hegelians in their philosophical career. That is, they saw the world as a kind of a world of conflicts, of opposites, and then those opposites somehow or another clash, but they coalesce, and in the clashing, something dies off and something is preserved, a synthesis as it's usually called, or a kind of compromise, middle position. And so, like Marx, Dewey will start off as a Hegelian, but he will eventually adopt a materialistic view of that whole process, just as Marx did. Okay, so those are the similarities that I've noticed between him and Marx. So he fully rejects the existence of a transcendent reality. Okay, so there's no God, there's no transcendent being, there are no transcendent values, there's no transcendent knowledge or truth. In other words, there is no appeal to another world for any of these things. So a little bit like Nietzsche, he's going to say, that none of that is really an appropriate way to begin to do anything or to think about anything anymore. And so he would agree, God is dead. Now let's go on and live our lives and build our world and our society and our kids and our education and so forth and so on, as if that's the case, and not appeal to this. So he's an anti-realist in this sense. Realism is one of those words that kind of gets muddled because different people want to use it to mean different things. But he's an anti-realist. He does not believe that the essences are real at all. Just like Occam and the nominalist that we saw earlier in the semester. So he would be a thoroughgoing nominalist here and hold to this radical empirical approach to the world. And we'll look at that radical empiricism just now. So his epistemology, along with Peirce and James, was empiricist and radical empiricist. James, openly used that idea of radical empiricism. And so the idea of radical empiricism is that it does lead to a kind of skepticism. Hume had already experimented with this. If you remember when we looked at the British empiricism and how Hume took that to its logical conclusions. That is, if you're a radical empiricist, then you can only accept what your senses, what your experience is telling you right now. And what it told you in the past, you can't really rely on because the world could have changed. And so knowledge is ever changing. It's always in flux. Knowledge is choiling about and churning and so forth and so on because the world is doing that too. Okay? And so radical empiricism says you just have to roll with it in a sense. As the world changes, what you say is true has to change. And so there can't be any fixed truth, okay? Because truth has to change and adapt just as rapidly as the world does. And so this leads to a kind of skepticism in the sense that there is no fixed truth. You're skeptical about any kind of fixed, transcendent, or absolute truth. Therefore, one never really has truth with a capital T. All one ever has is just a close approximation to the way things are at the moment. Okay? So, certainty, that old quest of Descartes for finding some type of indubitable starting point and then building an indubitable kind of certain structure of knowledge upon that starting point is folly on this view. Okay? And so, certainty remains unattainable about anything, and the best we can do is just use our experiences now to arrive at claims about the world that allow us to achieve the ends that we want, to progress somehow. Thus, truth claims are just approximations. If I say something, you ask me, was that true? I might say, well, yeah, that's true, but it's only in a sense true in a sense that, yeah, that's the way things are at this moment, okay? They're just close approximations. And so you just have to be happy with that and move on. All truth claims are just close enough for the moment, close enough to move on, And so Our truth claims are just approximations about reality that help us to survive and flourish in the moment. Forget about finding any absolute truth because it just doesn't exist. Civilization has already wasted too much precious time on this effort, and it's time for us to move on. It's a wild goose chase. That's the Deweyan, pragmatist, Peircean, Jamesian view of knowledge. Now, I'm going to tie this in towards the end of this lecture to postmodernity, because there's a close connection between these guys and the postmodern world through the thinker Richard Rorty. Okay, but just wait for that. So what we know comes from the senses. This is true. It comes through what we see, what we hear, and so forth. However, nobody can capture reality fully, and we are trapped in our own perceptions, governed by our own inner drives. So Peirce, James, and Dewey would have us just stop chasing this phantasm of certainty and knowledge and truth and just get on with figuring out how to make our lives better in the moment. Okay? So that's kind of their epistemological approach. What is human nature and what is his philosophical anthropology? Well, like I said, he buys into the Darwinian idea that we have evolved from lower species, that we're not created in God's image, which was the main alternative in his day, and perhaps remains the main alternative now. You're either created or you evolved. There's not many other options, really. Humans are evolved creatures that must interact and adapt to their environment, according to Dewey. And so we're just an organic part of this physical world because we're just the physical world itself also. So you see, here's this materialistic view of humanity. What is morality? Well, Dewey, he believed, that morality was something that was very important, and ethics and so forth. He has strong views on these things. He views morality and says that it must fall under the pragmatist mindset. We choose values and morals to fulfill our drive for flourishing and for progress. And so human beings, they come to and they make moral decisions and come up with moral rules and then put those into law sometimes and make laws for their society because they feel like they think that's going to help them to flourish. By all measures, Dewey lived a very normal life. He had many, many children, was a married man for many years until his wife died. I think he married later on in life again and even adopted 2 more children. And he lived a fairly normal life of traditional values. But strictly speaking, he would say that he embraced all these values, these norms, and these ethics because they helped us attain social cohesion and help us to attain some type of synergy. So these moral rules, he would say, these mores are just instruments. They are instrumental. They're not idealistic and transcendental values and absolutes. So what is good is what helps us to flourish in our current social context. Now, what about politics and history? Now, Dewey is very much interested in politics. You will not find anyone who advocates more powerfully for democracy than Dewey. He believed in egalitarian values and principles because he believes that our richest resources lie in every individual person. So for Dewey, politics and history invariably leads to this kind of a democratic social organization. And he leans toward what might be called an egalitarianism, or sometimes he even looks like he's a quasi kind of socialist here. Never a full-blown communist or anything, but he kind of has some socialistic leanings. And you see that, for example, in some of the organizations that he participated in. He helped to start teachers' unions. He helped to found and lead the ACLU and so forth and so on. And so he has some of these progressive and yes, left-leaning tendencies in politics. Thus, values for individuals should engender this democratic society. And so his view about democracy, this egalitarian society, kind of feeds back into and informs the way he thinks that kids should be educated. Okay? So education for this type of society means that individuals must learn through life experience to promote democracy. So if you're going to prepare kids to go out and live in a democratic world, then you need to do things democratically inside the educational world itself as you're training children. Classes need to be democratic, all kinds of things. Children need to be taught democratic principles down inside the classroom level, okay? So schools need to have, student governance. This whole idea of student governance is kind of this Deweyan idea of teaching children basic democratic principles, teaching them how to have meetings and how to do things in a orderly democratic way is part of that educational influence of Dewey. So if everyone is equal in society, then education must prepare students for entering such a society. Classrooms and schools need to operate democratically and democratize knowledge and democratize learning. And so there's this democratization effect. And we live in a society now that is, this democratization has great momentum at this moment. And it's not only because of Dewey, but just because of the whole momentum and the force of our society. But other worldview elements fit in with this emerging schemes. For example, death would be extinction. History is just progress towards this egalitarian society based upon empirical science and empirical social science. So like Marx, Dewey accepts this Hegelian idea of history as something that is progressing up, but he is looking at it in a material way. Okay.